Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, part of the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we discuss how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, we will be doing a crossover with Jason Littlefield from Reformation Radio. In this episode, we will discuss the false dichotomy between liberalism and conservatism, and in particular, how these two labels are often little more than arbitrary tribal tags. But before we get to that, Elizabeth and Mike will quickly reflect on the discussion Jason and Mike are going to have. Hello again. So, as we kind of implied in the introduction, this week's podcast is going to be a crossover with Reformation Radio, which is another podcast that's affiliated with the Institute of Liberal Values. In the podcast, I spoke with Jason, who some of you might know, about the kind of false dichotomy between conservatism and liberalism, and how conservatives seem to be striving to conserve liberal values and demonizing liberals for some reason best known to themselves, and vice versa, of course. Elizabeth, any thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the things that I noticed throughout in this crossover, it was that you're a very optimistic person in general, but you were particularly optimistic in this podcast, that Jason would sort of maybe doomsday a little bit, and you were right. It's like, no, I think we're going to be okay. And so I just, I'd be interested in your thoughts in general. I don't know if you and I have the same, am I the doomsday person and you're always the positive one? I don't think that. I just noticed a different side. To me, yeah, it was a little bit different side of you.
Well, in the first instance, yes, I am optimistic.
Yes.
There are two reasons for that. One, I think, is pragmatic, and the other, I think, is a reflection of reality. On the pragmatic side, if I wasn't optimistic, why bother? Why get up in the morning?
Why get up in the morning?
Don't get me wrong. Yeah. I don't. That doesn't mean that these people don't fill me with doubt, that they don't worry me, that I don't think that they're doing horrific damage. I mean, they do fill me with doubt. I do sometimes despair at the possibility that they might have won already. I don't think they have, but that does concern me. And look, even if I think that we're going to win, it doesn't preclude the reality, which is that they have done a hell of a lot of damage, and they are so embedded within our institutions that it's unthinkable that they won't continue to do a lot more damage as well. And yet, hateful movements that seek to demonize innocent individuals don't flourish, not for long. They can't flourish. The classic example is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union quickly ran out of oppressors, people who maybe legitimately were awful. I'm sure the Soviet Union got rid of some awful people. And it had to invent classes of oppressors. First it was the Mensheviks. Then it was slightly heretical Bolsheviks who would have been within the Overton window originally of what would have been acceptable to be a Bolshevik, and the Mensheviks were within the Overton window, and it kept shrinking as they ran out of more and more people to purge, because, the Soviet Union was dysfunctional in many ways. And so they needed somebody to blame. And so they had to start, burning their own people, burning their own witches, if you like. And that can only go on for so long, because eventually you run out of people and then you have to start turning in on yourselves. And I think that we're seeing that happening with critical social justice. So, I'm optimistic in the pragmatic sense. I think that you have to be, otherwise what's the point? But also from a historical point of view, the evidence would all be on the side of liberalism. Liberal societies are the ones that flourished. Liberalism outlasted the Soviet Union. And I'm not saying wokeism is the same with the Soviet Union, but communism in the Soviet Union, but it has some key similarities. And liberalism just delivers, and the alternatives don't. And so that's why I'm confident and optimistic.
Yeah, it was nice. I enjoyed hearing you argue the positive. One other thing that really this was maybe probably 3/4 of the way through. Jason brought up what is it, like Red August, 1966 in China, and talking about destroying the 4 olds, OLDS. Old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits, and cultivating, the 4 news, and I had, I'm, as you know, I'm historically and geographically challenged. So this was not something that I was familiar with. I mean, I was only 2 years old in 1966, so I guess I can be forgiven for that. But you weren't even born, and I'm sure you knew about it. So, you all didn't really explore that very much, but I didn't know if, I think that's relevant to a lot of the things that we've talked about, sort of, destroying that. I know it's relevant to a lot of the things that I talk to my students about. So I do talk to them about how we always think as we're, sort of growing up, say, maybe, college students, that they're thinking, oh, I'm finally there. I'm a fully formed person, right? And I'm rid of the olds, right? My old ideas and my old customs, my old habits, maybe even my old culture, because I'm leaving, I'm growing up, I'm going to, create my new one. And now we know what's best. We're the news, right? And we have the new ideas, and so we're fully formed now. And I think that, I try to remind them, that they've thought this many times in their lives, and that they will, continue to think that they're, that whatever's the new is, that now we're done. We're finally there. And I often think about what that means, even in terms of our podcast, for example, in terms of our own, development. I think that, I was just listening to a podcast the other day. It's a sports one, and they made reference to, I try not to put too much out there on social media that's, too extreme or whatever. And, I don't want to make a mistake that ruins me or whatever. And the other guy that's on with him said, you mean
Right.
like the first 100 episodes of this podcast? And I think about that in terms of us, it's like, I think that we're trying really hard to remind ourselves that we're not fully formed, right? And that our ideas that we're not done. We're not fully baked yet. But I do think it's hard to remind ourselves of that, and how we might, look back on, some missteps or some not fully formed ideas. And so I don't know, how much about Red August and the ensuing years, and whether you've thought anything about that, because you all didn't really go into it at the time.
Answer the first comment about the podcast to begin with. Well, the last comment you kind of ended on, and then we'll go back into kind of Maoism and all that loveliness. I hope we do. Right, I hope we do look back on episodes and ideas that maybe we were quite confident in at the time, and then we pick it apart and move on completely. That would show growth. Certainly if I look at stuff that I wrote when I was an undergraduate, I mean, Christ, it's embarrassing, but it shouldn't be embarrassing. It should be something that you feel glad about, because it shows that you've transcended the boundaries of what you once were. So that's progress. but progress is built on something, right? Progress is the episodes that we've done, it's not largely been us completely synthesizing new ideas. We are reflecting on research that is being done by other people, or philosophical articles that have been done by other people, and we are standing on the shoulders of giants, that kind of thing. That's what we're doing, and then making incremental steps, some of which will be missteps, towards a clearer picture on the topic that we're trying to understand, which at the moment is ideological or psychological, because the two are kind of intertwined but not quite the same thing. Intolerance. So yeah, I mean, our ideas, even if our ideas perfectly fit what we were talking about at that given moment in time, they will have to change anyway, because the thing which we are analyzing is not an unyielding piece of granite, but rather the product of human interaction, and therefore something that is in flux. So yes, I mean, there will be things that we look back on that will change, and that's as it ought to be. So yeah, there's that kind of movement forward in terms of but movement forward is based on something, and it's not. So you think about adaptation, like as an organism evolves, it adapts to its environment. It happens over millennia. As human beings, because we have intelligence, we're able to make psychological, intellectual adaptations in a much quicker way, but it still seems to follow the same set of rules, right? We're adapting to society, we're adapting to changes in society, and we're trying to do our best in order to position ourselves and the society, people, and institutions that we care about so that they can deal with these challenges, or embrace them. Some changes can be positive. I think if you contrast that to the kind of changes that were, I mean, okay, so you can use Maoism as an example, but the real classic example would be the revolution in France, because that's where Edmund Burke really starts writing reflections on the revolution in France, and this is where you're at a point where, and this is many intellectuals, this is many academics who fall in love with themselves. They recognize that they're very smart. They correctly point out a number of problems with society. And that's great. But it's much harder to do the next thing, right? It's much harder to put in a series of changes that don't, on balance, turn out to be much, much, much worse for the people you claim to be intervening on behalf of than the system that you set out to criticize, which you then replaced. And that was the problem with Maoism. That was the problem with the Bolshevik Revolution. That was the problem with the revolution in France, and that's the problem with revolution in general. Burke famously said that a society that cannot change cannot conserve itself. So conservatism, as a philosophy, does embrace change. You have to. You can't adapt to the situation, but changes should be piecemeal. They should be small, because some of them are going to be missteps, and you have to roll them back.
And look, the olds existed for some reason, and we did learn from them. And getting rid of the olds and replacing them with the news.
I mean, to give you an example,
is not always
the royal family in the United Kingdom. As a Brit, I have some affection for the Queen as an individual. She seemed to play the role very well and sacrificed maybe a private life for the country, and she certainly, by all accounts, seems to have been a very admirable person. But from a logical, rational, reasonable point of view, I can't for the life of me see what the point of the royal family is. I don't hate any of them. I don't even hate the institution. But I don't get it, right? And America is a very similar country in many ways, and you seem to be doing just fine without a monarch. And yet, so me as a younger man, I would have said, well, what's the point? I can't see any positives of it. I can see that there are negatives. Why are we paying all the money to these people? Why should prestige or power be invested in unelected individuals? Just what is up with that? There's it's very easy to notice things that are wrong about that. And as a younger man, I would have said, look, well, this is more than justification to get rid of them. And I'm not talking about off with their heads. I'm just, retire the institution in a dignified way. But now I'm not so sure. And it's not so much that my thinking has changed, because I still can't for the life of me see what the point of them is. It's just that I'm aware that there might be a lot that I'm missing.
Right. And that's what it means, right, to remain, sort of open-minded. There is an intellectual humility, that respect for the old, that, again, I mean, this is one of the things we always are talking about in the podcast, right? That there's, because there's value in all these different kinds of social, psychological, and cognitive, developmental kind of issues. So, and the same thing, sort of historically, like, there is a reason why it survived so long, and maybe we don't know all of those reasons because we can't possibly, absorb them all. So yeah, I just, that really struck me, this sort of like getting, get rid of the olds and, and cultivate for news. And I feel as though that's, a little bit of what's going on here, right? That, like, there's not very much respect for all of the progress, right? All of this historical work that, that people have spent their lifetimes working for. It's not good enough. Get rid of all that old, because now we know what the new thing, should be, and that's what's going to. Now we're fully baked. Now we know what's
arrogant.
right.
It's arrogant. Go back to the royal family. Like, I don't know all of the various interactions they have with state. I don't know. Right. I can say that the royal family in the UK has coexisted with the UK being an incredibly open, tolerant, and diverse society, going by contemporary standards and historical standards as well. So, the chances of them being nefarious is, or on balance nefarious, I'm sure they're doing some things that are bad, but the chance of them being on balance nefarious is quite small. So I don't understand it. And so therefore, me in my present state, I would say, rip it out. No, I'm not confident. I mean, I start to think of myself like a surgeon. Do you know what I mean? Like a surgeon will try and do, intervention when they cut you open. That's the last resort.
The most minimally invasive.
I would see society in that way. And that's what renders me slightly conservative. But what am I conserving? Well, what I'm trying to conserve, I cherish these institutions. I agree with lots of the more radical thinkers who correctly diagnose problems. But my approach would be, well, let's be a little bit cautious here, because, if we pull this out, maybe you will have a positive effect here, but how can you be sure that you won't have a cascading series of negative effects here? And that often happens with policy. So I'm very, very cautious. And I'm also, it's not just caution, it's also appreciation and gratitude of the people who have come before. And I'm not just talking about the great people, the Thomas Jeffersons or the Winston Churchills, although them too. Also the people whose names we've forgotten, the postman who was doing the rounds in your neighborhood in the 1950s, made a contribution. All of these small people, not small people, that's wrong, but the people that aren't noticed in society, all of these many tiny little cogs in society, they all combine to make the machine that is the United States of America, that is South Korea, that is the United Kingdom work. Without them, it can't. And so it's an appreciation and a gratitude to these people that make up these institutions, and an understanding that I don't get it, right? I get that things are great. I get that things need to change, otherwise we can't adapt. But I don't have enough confidence to go through and start making sweeping changes, because if I were to have that confidence and I also had the power to pull it off, which mercifully I don't, then the changes that I would be making would be far more likely to be on balance negative than they would to be on balance positive, as the Bolshevik Revolution shows us, as the French Revolution shows us, as Maoist China shows us.
So that's really, what I got out of it was, I think that I think people will like the tone of it. I found it optimistic. I found it very, I found both you and Jason very, humble, and I could tell that you really enjoyed the conversation, that the two of you had a good time.
Well, thank you very much. So without further ado, after our little reflection, we'll now go straight into the podcast episode on Reformation Radio, which Jason entitled Conserving Liberalism.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Reformation Radio. We interrupt this regular scheduled programming to bring a special interview with Mike Burke. We will be back with part 2 of the What is Woke series next week. Mike and Eric and I will get together for that. However, I do believe this particular episode will be a good listen in between those 2 episodes, because this is essentially, once again, okay, so what are we for? And this is what we are for, and I look forward to getting into that. So the theme of this show is going to be conserving liberalism, looking for ways to ditch the archaic left versus right paradigm, because at this point it's a false paradigm, and adjust to what our reality is in this particular moment. And that is a highly illiberal social order that is replacing free and liberal societies, not just in America, but across the West. And we're going to really get into that today. Here to visit with us about that is Mike Burke.
Hello.
Hello, Mike. Mike Burke is an academic from England whose research and consulting interests include education, political philosophy, and ideology. His present research focus is critical social justice, ideology, and the advantages and challenges it poses to national security of the United Kingdom and other liberal democracies. He also has written on and maintains an interest in Islamism and contemporary far-right thinking. Mike is one of the hosts for the Institute for Liberal Values podcast, The Dissidents. Wonderful
I am indeed.
Stuff you are doing, and I am glad to be now working a little bit more closely with you because you and I are both involved with the Institute for Liberal Values. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. Lots to talk about. Like you, I've noticed that aspects of critical social justice, or wokery in the shorthand, if you like, I mean, we can get more into that, have really captured most of the major institutions in the West, and are creeping into the East as well, by the way. We're starting to see it in Japan, in South Korea. I'm not sure, because of cultural reasons, whether it will get such a tough hold there as it has done in the West, but it certainly is a threat on quite a number of levels.
What fascinates me is how we are obviously from different parts of the world. Another title for this episode could be for people that like accents.
Quite.
So us noticing the same things, and my noticing that the wokery, as you call it, is a cultural weapon, a cultural means to reshape and reorganize human society, and seeing how this one way of being and thinking and knowing is taking root in institutions all over the world, while the UN and the World Economic Forum and other central planning organizations are planning to remake the political and economic sphere organization of human history. So essentially, I've said it before and I'll say it again, humankind, the concept of liberty and sovereignty are being smushed between two walls, a bottom-up revolution, which is the culture, the wokery, what's taking place in academia and the institutions, the entertainment, and then the top-down, which is the political and economic policies and ways of thinking behind this, like the central bank digital currencies, like the 15-minute cities, like carbon tracking and tracing. All of these things are examples of economic and political tyranny that's slowly being waged on us and will ultimately be waged on the generation that follows us. That's why I think it's really important for all of us, every single one of us on this planet, to take inventory of what's important and what do we want to advance.
Yeah, and have you noticed that the way in which this is kind of leveled over us, we're supposed to, the arguments that we're presented with are pretty shoddy, right? The arguments, for example, for systemic racism are pretty shoddy. Again, that's not to say that racism doesn't exist and isn't abhorrent. It's absolutely abhorrent to us as liberals. But we're supposed to accept these shoddy arguments as a matter of course, as if it was something like good manners. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
I believe in good manners. I believe that you should say please and thank you, and that is a matter of course. That's a tradition that is ingrained into us over generations, and good if you do that. But we're having these new kind of quite bold and striking ideological claims hoisted over us, and if we don't accept them, if we say, well, hold on a second, okay, I accept the possibility that maybe all white people are innately racist on some level that they're unconscious of, and that therefore could predict for racist behavior and therefore disproportionate outcomes. As a hypothesis, okay, where's your evidence? But you can't say that, because as soon as you say that, as soon as you question the dogma, it's not about, you're not supposed to question these things. You're supposed to question other things, but you're not supposed to question that. You have to accept it as a matter of course. And this is fundamentally illiberal. And the same with climate change. I believe that climate change is caused by people. I believe that it's going to cause lots of negative consequences. I believe that it's caused plenty of negative consequences already. But to what extent? To what extent does it cause those negative consequences? And what can we actually do about it? Because, going back to the Dark Age, well, you first. But these kinds of just obvious common sense observations that involve questioning dogma, will get you labeled all kinds of things.
It does, and it has. And one of the things that I believe is that the more of us that do questioning will become the norm. And through that questioning, individuals within their hearts and in their minds and with an integrity check can decide which ideas do we want our institution or our organization to advance. Do we want to advance this new way of thinking that views it's the individual liberty and sovereignty and freedom of the individual that is causing the problems, and we need to conquer that individual's liberty through the central bank digital currency, through the 15-minute cities, through the carbon tracking, through the surveillance state. So all of those top-down political tyrannies are being implemented. Why in our culture, we are getting people used to thinking and reacting to each other by stereotyped traits based off of their biologies. People are now being conditioned to believe that humans are either good or bad according to the biology that they were born in. That is the illiberal culture that's taking root.
And it's terrifying, isn't it? I mean, Solzhenitsyn famously observed that, I'm paraphrasing here, that the line between good and evil ran through the heart of each man.
Yeah.
That you'd have to, the implication would be that, all human beings are capable of doing evil. but they're also capable of doing good. And so that was why he couldn't bring himself to condemn his prison guards in the gulag. And yet now we're at this perplexing point where something that 5 cultural minutes ago would have been obviously morally, deeply, profoundly morally wrong, is now considered to be okay. So it's okay to abuse people for them being white, male, and heterosexual. And this is absolutely astonishing. 5 years ago, nobody would have, I mean, a couple of fringe lunatics perhaps, but nobody would have said that was okay.
Right. And now we're organizing society around this and putting this into place. And one of the things that I realized, I started hearing about ableism a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, the ultimate ableist thing to do is walk. So if all of us that have the ability to walk are oppressors, and one of the other big oppressors that I'm hearing about is cisgender. So if you are somebody that was born with a penis and you claim to be a man, or you were born with a vagina and you claim to be a woman, then by your very nature and existence, you are an oppressor.
Right, let's give the devil his due a little bit here, okay? So this kind of idea of cis normativity, so the whole idea of, let's say, the masculine man, or the expectation that the masculine man should be the most forthright person in culture, there's a little bit something to that. I mean, I don't have any gender identity issues personally, and yet I can see why people would do. For example, I remember being a teenager in school in the UK, and the kind of the pressure, the kind of the normative pressure, if you like, was to be somebody who watched and talked about and played a lot of football, or soccer, as you Americans call it. I wasn't particularly interested in that. A little bit I was, but I much preferred the pursuits of the mind. I was more interested in philosophy, reading, music, that kind of thing. And so because I broke with the normative pattern, I got a lot of homophobic abuse. I was bullied for being gay, quite horrendously. It didn't matter that I wasn't gay. That was kind of irrelevant, but I was bullied for it. So there is a kind of there is a line of truth there. And I think it's worth, as I said, giving the devil his due, because I think that line of truth is then used to bully people who are not guilty of the kind of thing that I was made victim to. In actual fact, I was victim to it. I was never perpetrating it. But you notice that it's all very performative when they talk about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not. So, for example, you raised another concept, ableism. Okay, is life going to be more difficult for you because you're disabled? Yes, kids can be cruel. You're likely to be bullied. People will look down upon you in a certain way, and all of that's wrong. We would be very much against that, because we're the kind of people who believe in not necessarily the actual soul in and of itself, although some of us might, but certainly that kind of spark of dignity that is the individual. So yeah, again, bullying disabled people is wrong, but ableism, come on, they only play lip service to this, right? So, for example, okay, ableism, and they list it. It's disabled people. It's the neurodiverse. The neurodiverse is my favorite one, because I am, quotation marks, neurodiverse. I'm clearly on the autism spectrum. Was told so as a kid. And that's manifest in me thinking differently, which is probably obvious that I do if you're listening to me. And so the people who are being kicked out by woke culture, by these people who are boasting about, oh, we're the champions of the neurodiverse, autistic people are suffering massively because of this. And that, by their own standards, should be a form of ableism.
Yeah.
Microaggressions, right? Okay. Again, I'm not saying that humans can't find horrible, subtle ways of bullying people, but if you're autistic, you don't communicate in the same way that most people do, and therefore somebody just labels this concept of microaggression on you. So you're alienating autistic people while claiming to be anti-ableist. What about the trans thing? And again, giving the devil his due, trans people are real and they need as much respect and love as anybody else, because we're individualists, right?
Absolutely.
And yet you look at the people who are, transitioning as children and then going on to regret it. A huge number of them are autistic. A huge number of them.
Oh yeah.
And that's ableist too. So it's like they on the one hand, they claim about being the champions for, the disabled, for the neurodiverse or whatever. And great. If you were that, that would be fantastic. But you're not that. You're a predator.
Right. One of the things that you touched on, man, I hated hearing about that experience growing up. But what that reminded me of is an example of othering, one of those basic human nasty things that we do. And that's one of the things that I've been working towards solving. I know I'll never completely solve it, but with empowered humanity theory, and I don't want to get too far into that, but that's why I came up with that. When I realized if we practice seeing other people as we see ourselves, if we humanize everybody, and we find ways to intentionally honor the dignity between those people, and we take opportunities to look for suffering that we can ease, that we look for ways to disrupt judgmental and fearful-based thinking that is part of that othering process, and replace those thinking processes with thoughts of inquiry and compassion, and really working towards retraining our brain and retraining how we see each other if we are to maintain a liberal society. What I noticed with critical social justice is they point out the problem is humankind, and the only tools that they are using are tools purposed to erode individual sovereignty, and how it's taking place from the inside out. It's destroying. We've talked before about how it's destroying the neural circuitry associated with our well-being. It's obviously destroying relationships. It's obviously destroying creativity and productivity in the workplace. It's obviously cultivating so much confusion, so much division, even between own families, the division. It's cutting off knowledge and information and a relationship with a higher power. So these are all of the things that's doing. So I came up with empowered humanity theory as a way to cultivate and strengthen what is best within each person and tamp down those capacities of prejudice and those tendencies that we have to other. We have to do something differently.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, here's the point. John Stuart Mill, I'm arguably the greatest liberal thinker of them all, right? In On Liberty, makes it really clear that, if you don't know your opponent's arguments, it's not just that, you might be really good. You might know your own stuff and you might be able to articulate it really, really, really well. But if you really want to have an appreciation of what you're going up against, you have to know your opponent's arguments in their best form, right? You need to be better at those arguments than the vast majority of people who advocate for them are, right? So you really need to try and get into the head of the person you're going up and opposing. And so if you can't look at critical social justice and find something in it that's worthwhile, and there is stuff that I've kind of given you some examples. I'll give you another one. Charles Mill's Critique of Ideal Theory is a kind of updated version of Edmund Burke's observation on trying to have gratitude for the generations that have come. Mills goes on and talks about, we can't get rid of society and build an ideal one because we wouldn't have anything to base it on. So okay, I can look in that and I can find good stuff. But what I'm finding increasingly, and this is not purely a woke thing, they definitely do it, but it happens on the right too. So I mean, I make sure, for example, that I I do not demonize people unless they've been particularly demonic. But you know, I'll give people as much charity as I possibly can, and to the point of even allowing them to do me some considerable damage. And even then, you know, the option for forgiveness is always open. You know, if you show that you've moved on, I'll forgive you. But I notice within discourse these days, for example, that the American right, there are good people on the American right who don't seem to know what a liberal is. And equally, on the American left, they don't seem to know what a conservative is either. They have no idea. And I'm not talking about, you know, your average Joe Blogs. I'm talking about academics. For example, I was teaching a course on ideology last semester. And I was looking for an article that would give a decent steel manning of what conservatism is, and then would then go on to raise some criticisms about it, right? Because that's what a critical piece should be. Now, I'm sure there are pieces like that out there, but I couldn't find one. I couldn't find anything that would give conservatism a fair shake, which means that there are all these, you know, academics in Princeton and Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge who don't get that which they're going up against. And if they don't get what conservatism is, they have no business attacking it. You're not qualified to attack it if you don't know what it is. Equally, American talk show host that I sometimes listen to, because I try to listen to the left and the right, a guy called, one of the big ones in America. Do you know Dan Bongino? Have you heard of him?
I think I've seen some of his videos.
He's like,
yeah,
really kind of,
yeah.
I don't know. He seems like a really decent bloke, but very kind of gruff. Again, seems like an honourable and decent human being, and that, by the way, should be your default. You know, when you're encountering somebody, you shouldn't be thinking that they're motivated by malice, even if you think that they're wrong. But it seems like a decent, intelligent human being. And he just goes on and on about liberals and liberalism. And it's like, you don't even know what the word means. You're talking about standing up for liberty, justice, freedom of speech. That's what a liberal is. Yeah. Now, you might be a conservative liberal, and I think he is, but you're a liberal. What are you trying to conserve? What's the whole point of conservatism without liberalism? Like America is the quintessential liberal democracy. You could argue maybe England, but I think most people would agree that America is the quintessential liberal democracy in the world. It's the distillation of the Enlightenment.
It was.
That's what you want to conserve. Wow, I think it still is.
I think it's teetering, and most people don't realize that the principles of liberalism and conservatism are embedded in our Constitution. I mean, those are principles that uniquely make up this crazy thing called America. The thing that's happened over at least the past 10, even maybe 20 years, is that what you just described is the complete false divide, the archaic left versus right, conservative versus liberals, when nobody knows what those words mean. And if divide and conquer is a real strategy, which it is a real strategy used for, I don't know, since the beginning of time.
Well, most recently by the Chinese Communist Party and the Russian Federation, who will kind of back, you know, and I see good in both of these sides, right? They will back the kind of the separatist, nationalist, right, populist right wing in America. They'll put money in backing them, and at the same time, they'll be backing the woke so-called liberals, because they just want to tear your society apart.
Yeah,
and Britain as well, but you know. Britain's not the first priority anymore. It hasn't been since the fall of the empire, unfortunately. But America, yeah, absolutely. They're trying to tear America apart and the rest of the West, and it's working.
And it's not, I'll say it's not just China and Russia. You know, it's not just, and even, I guess, the new BRICS alliance as a whole, it's them, because that alliance is in competition with the UN and WEF and their plans for the world. You know, you have these two grand plans for global domination, and the people, us, we're the prize for both of them, and we are in a false divide.
Oh, completely. Like, it's supposed to be, it's a complete false dichotomy, conservative and liberal. I am a conservative, and I am a conservative because I am a liberal.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That's the point. That's what I want to conserve. That's what I want to conserve. The most diverse, tolerant, prosperous, open-minded societies ever to have existed at any point in human history, anywhere on the planet, by far. That's what I want to conserve.
Yep. I said that same, I swear to God, I said that same thing 5-6 years ago. And when I voiced that, that was the first time I was ever accused of being political, A, B, a conservative, C, a Republican, and I even got accused of being a Trump supporter for...
Oh, yeah, that's happened to me.
Trump. And I'm like, none of those apply none of those apply and or are accurate in any way. But what I started noticing is that particular thing, you just said it happened to you, it happens to everybody. So, and I believe that 86 to 90% of all people want exactly what you just went through. Want
it's clear.
Freedom, want prosperity, want opportunities, want fairness, want to live in a society where everybody treats each other equally.
Yep.
That's what most people want, but that is the very thing that we are honestly less than a decade away from losing. Because
I don't think so. I think that the liberal order will prevail, and I'll tell you why. Grand plans never work out. Right? You know, Edmund Burke famously said that, you know, the great conservative philosopher Edmund Burke, who was also a liberal, here's another case in point, right? He was a Whig. He wasn't a Tory. He was a British parliamentarian. He was a Whig, liberal, not a Tory. But he's known as the greatest conservative philosopher. And one of his observations was that England is a nation of shopkeepers. Right? And at that time, England was the preeminent power in the world. And what did he mean by that? Well, what he meant by that is that people are best able to, you know, a society functions best when power is divested away from the center. You know, some things have to be centralized, a military structure, for example. But generally speaking, an economy, a society works best when power is mostly at the local level. So this kind of World Economic Forum plans of centralizing, you know, absolutely everything is sure to fail as Xi Jinping's China is sure to fail.
Well,
you know, there is no human being who has the cognitive capacity to deal with all of these different things, even if they're an absolute genius. And in the case of Xi, he clearly isn't. Neither is Putin. And you see that these economies are falling apart. So any kind of plan that you do like that, I mean, the closest they got to achieving anything was this, you know, the kind of people who thought that kind of planning could work was the Soviet Union. And that collapsed.
Well, it eventually collapsed. There was a period of starvation, mass
Ukraine,
murder.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, and so on.
So that's what, if you're one of these people who, and this is one of the great triumphs of Christianity. Are you a Christian? I know I kind of got that impression from you, but you are?
Yes.
Okay, great. I don't know whether I am. I mean, I try and live as if the Bible were true, right? I know it's a source of great inspiration for me, but I sometimes don't believe in a God or whatever. But you know, I culturally certainly a Christian. One of the great triumphs of Christianity was outsourcing heaven to the hereafter. You know, the utopia, the kingdom of God is real, but you can't access it on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think that you can, then that's pride, which is a sin. And it's a great observation, isn't it? Because you think about all of those people who, the likes of Joseph Stalin.
Well, we celebrate
the likes of Adolf Hitler.
We celebrate Pride. That's part of.
Yes.
That's part of the.
What's great is, but that's not liberal, is it? Well, it depends what you mean. It depends what you mean by pride. I mean, I think
I just take it as it. I don't want to. I just take it for what it is, pride, and that is a deadly sin.
If you're a Catholic, are you a Catholic?
If you're no. One of the things
I caught a Protestant coming out with Catholic rhetoric.
One of the things I want to go back and touch on is how the central planning organizations can and are taking over locally. And one of the things that comes to mind is the World Economic Forum's work with universities. In particular, even Oklahoma University. There is a partnership there. So what you have is these local entities putting forth the literature and the ideas. So the people in this generation are talking about the ideas and putting some into policy already. And then what's coming up behind will be just more nails in that coffin. And here in the U.S., FedNow, which is the predecessor for the central bank digital currency. So these things are starting to enter society. One of the questions that I have for you is, how do you know, or how will the liberal order survive? Like, what's it? I appreciate your optimism, so I want to know.
Because there is no alternative to it other than a horrendous bloodbath. Could the US descend into a horrendous bloodbath? Is that possible? I suppose it's possible, but I think it's unlikely. Like, how would you separate out your... So, for example, okay, so let's look at it on one level. The forces that you're describing, let's call them the forces of darkness. If they aren't the forces of darkness, they might as well be. So this should resonate both with atheists and religious believers alike. So what would they need in order to prevail? Well, the urban centers are dependent upon the rural ones, right? Arguably, the urban centers are more dependent upon rural areas than the rural areas are dependent upon the urban centers. And so if you look at the way things break up in the United States, the rural centers tend to be conservative, tend to be Christian, certainly more traditionalist, whereas the urban centers tend to be liberal. And there's a very good reason for this, by the way. Younger people tend to be more liberal in their views. I bet you were more liberal when you were younger, right? Well, no, I'm using liberal in the wrong way here. More progressive. See, I'm getting caught in this linguistic trap.
Right.
You were probably more progressive when you were younger.
Honestly, I have had the point of view that I have now since I was 17 years old.
Oh, okay.
When I was in 1992, I realized we talked about the false dichotomy. I realized it back then. I understood the great political debate of our time is nation states versus the global centralized society. And I knew that organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, they were picking and choosing presidential candidates because they would have a candidate. They would have a Republican and Democrat. So that way, whichever person wins, the uniparty always wins.
So this is the bipartisan consensus on foreign affairs, right? You might get a vote on gun control or gay marriage or something that didn't really matter to the elites, but on the stuff that was consequential for that, they made sure that they've backed those candidates until they.
And I guess, to your point, people 20, 30 years ago would call me, I would get labeled a Democrat because I was more for individual rights. And then as I've gotten older, people call me right or conservative or Republican, but my viewpoints have not changed.
I mean, mine have. I was a radical Marxist when I was about 12. For me, in the UK, I think Marxism is a stage of intellectual puberty that one has to go through.
Well, I read the Communist Manifesto, and I was, I did like, oh yeah, this is the cool thing, and so, but I never really bought into it as something that societies can live by.
No, they can't. And the clear reason for that is unpacked in the Gulag Archipelago, which is like, well, once you've got rid of your first class of oppressors, where is your second? Because, you need an excuse for why things aren't perfect. Why is the utopia not here? You've claimed power, you've got a revolution, you've killed all of the oppressors. But there's, we still don't have the perfect society. And so then they need an excuse, right? They need to just round up anybody for any old reason and say, this is why we're not where we want to be. The reason I think that the United States is in a good place, in spite of the profound problems that let's face it, that this is our mission of what we're doing, right? With the Institute of Liberal Values and in the various podcasts that we're doing in trying to overcome. And I think that you have it right. By trying to do this in a very Christian way. And again, I don't mean the religious sense, but having a very forgiving, tolerant, trying to see the good in other people, trying to reconcile people rather than divide them and demonize them. All of that's great. But there are geographic reasons why I think this won't happen in the United States, why the collapse is very difficult to happen. The divide between the traditional conservative, more Christian parts and the more progressive Democrat kind of parts is geographic, right? But it's not geographic in the sense that you can draw a line. It's not like you draw a line between France and Germany, for example. It's mixed up. You would have states that are very progressive, and yet their rural communities will still be very conservative, and vice versa. And there's a reason for this, I think. And as I was kind of alluding to before, younger people tend to be more progressive. They don't know what they don't know yet. And so as a consequence, they also tend to migrate from more rural areas to urban ones because they want the population density of an urban area because that helps them find a mate. And then once they found the mate, they then migrate back to the rural areas where suddenly they're surrounded by conservatives and they become conservative again. Whereas the old people who stay within cities, they've aged, they kind of suppress their conservative tendencies because they're surrounded by younger people. But I think if you're not a conservative, you're not really happy, are you?
I don't know.
Well, I mean, why would you want to tear something down? What would be the basis for me saying, okay, I'm going to tear down this social structure in society?
Oh, gotcha,
right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
It comes from a sense of unhappiness, doesn't it? And sometimes it's legitimate. Absolutely. Like, I am open to ideas from the left. I mean, on a political compass, I measure left of center. I still identify as a conservative because that's exactly what I want to protect, which is the liberal democracy we have today. But if you do, and by conservative, I don't mean right wing, right? That's not what you mean and not what I mean either, right? Like, if you're a conservative now, you're trying to conserve some of the gains that have been made by the political left. But yeah, I mean, conservatives tend to be happy people. That's why they want to conserve. They think that things are pretty good. If you're a progressive, you probably aren't as happy because you want to tear stuff down. And sometimes you need to, Right. But that's the dichotomy, isn't it? It's the dichotomy of, the real dichotomy is that of stasis and renewal.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than the tribal identities.
Yes. So I think the answer is, rather than this paradigm of the progressives are in constant destroying mode, and conservatives are in constant nothing will ever change mode, that in the middle, what we have is real liberalism, but to put in a new term, and this is what you said the other day we were in a meeting, and we were going back and forth about classical liberalism and liberalism, because I made the point that, well, classical liberalism, that's more of a descriptor of a specific political philosophy that is currently being, blamed for white supremacy and all of this, and some people believe it's antiquated and it didn't work. But you said the idea of open source liberalism.
Yeah.
And that's what I would like to, let's get into a little bit of that, because I see that as maybe a way of conservatives acknowledging that, some things we have to tweak, some things have to be changed, some things we have to improve on, and then for the progressives to understand that a lot of the things in the past, they have worked. That's why we are here now. So what we need to do is, instead of tearing everything down in hopes that something better will just emerge, then we need to be more strategic about what are we replacing, or what needs to be replaced, and what are we replacing it with. We can fix something, we can mend something, we can repair, we can add to. We don't need to destroy.
No, you really don't need to destroy. And there have been thinkers on the left that have understood this. Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, which is George Soros's favorite book that he apparently hasn't read. Because I don't know where he gets his play out of that book. The Open Society. Did you actually read that book, George? Really? Popper in that book talks about incremental change. That he says that, and from a mathematical point of view, this is a fact. There's actually quite an ancient paper that was written in the 1920s that demonstrated this to be true. If you're going to try and make any change in society, there is a good chance that change might, on balance, lead to counterproductive outcomes, right? And so what Popper argued was that, so the chances of those counterproductive outcomes being bigger also increases with how radical the change is. So it's a massive radical change that is changing all aspects of the society. There's a possibility that it might have, on balance, positive outcomes. There's a likelihood that it will have some positive outcomes, but the bigger the change is, the more the chance there is that it will on balance have negative outcomes, right? And so what you have to do in order to avoid that is, instead of having these big sweeping changes, you have these incremental changes. And these incremental changes will be pointed out probably by people who aren't particularly happy. And they're very close to the problems that are causing their unhappiness, and they're able to point out things that we can change. So this is what I mean by open source. There is a pathology on the right, which is stasis, right? Where you have a society that is just frozen in time. And again, the conservative philosopher Edmund Burke was very, very aware of this in his reflections on the revolutions in France. He said that, I'm paraphrasing, a society that can't change can't conserve itself. So even a conservative society has to have change. It has to embrace change. But it's finding that point, right? Where the pathology on the progressive side is the French Revolution, where you get all of these kinds of probably quite smart people, because they tend to be smart and they tend to have fallen in love with their own intellect. Pride from a Christian point of view, right? And they think that they know better than everybody else, even though they've had no experience in the affairs of state. And they think that, right, we're going to change all of these institutions and we're going to build something better. And you get the Bolshevik Revolution, you get the French Revolution, you get Mao's China, you get, it doesn't matter, wherever you look, it's a bloodbath. So liberalism is finding, or open source liberalism is saying, look, we've got a commitment to these core liberal values: individualism, freedom of speech, a belief in human reason, a gratitude to people who came before us, an appreciation of the institutions, but also a knowledge that they're not perfect and we will need to change them in order to adjust to the world as it evolves. But having people, and here will be the central point, that we don't just encourage differences of opinion. We don't just we need that. We cannot function as a society or as an emergent ideology, if you like, unless we have people who are willing to make conservative arguments and people who are willing to make progressive ones. We need each other. And that's what I mean by open source. I would like to open this liberal up to conservative Christians, because I think that the vast majority of them are liberal. I wouldn't even mind opening it up to some people who would consider themselves woke. There are people who are kind of on the critical social justice side who make some good points and arguments, and I'd want them in there, so long as we don't demonize each other, right? Because as soon as we cross into this line of demonization, where we're failing to see the humanity, or as you're a Christian, the grace, if you like, in each other.
Yep.
That's what we have to avoid. But we need each other, and the people that we don't need are the people who are the intolerant, the people who are demonizing people.
Yes. What I thought of as you were talking is a good way to distinguish between liberal and illiberal is if you believe that a group of people is bad because of how they vote, what their skin color is, what their gender is, what their sexuality is. If you think there's a group of people that are bad or that are oppressors, that's somebody that's bad is an oppressor. If you think there are bad people out there because of their inherent biology or how they vote, you are illiberal. You have fallen prey and victim to the ideology. You are now in that neo-Marxist mindset, and you're part of the tyranny in our culture.
Equally, it could come from the right as well.
Equally so.
So for example, if I could give an example of my own life, I had an incident where I was accused of racism by somebody who couldn't even give an example of how I'd been racist, right? Because I know their ideology. I read all of the critical social justice books. I know how to speak their language. I don't make missteps. I generally know their stuff better than they do. So they couldn't have an example. They couldn't do what they do with most people, which is take something and twist it, because I wouldn't go down that route, right? So they just made something up, and they were caught out in the act of making it up, but they managed to kind of get a bit of a witch hunting mob around me and cause me quite a deal of psychological distress. But what I noticed, and the way I dealt with it was also very Christian. This is where I'm taking cues from people like you. I turned the other cheek. And turning the other cheek is not laying down. People get that so wrong. They think that turning the other cheek is you just, let them do whatever. No. It was very, very strong. They were hurling all kinds of abuse at me. And I simply said, no, I accept that you feel the way in which you feel. I'm sorry that you felt that way. However, I can't apologize for my actions because I did not intend to make you feel that way. And I don't feel that you're being reasonable. Scream, 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 scream. Reiterate the same point. Stay firm, and turn the other cheek. What they want me to do is to shout at them and get really, really, really angry, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not going to do that because I'm going to give you what you want. And anyway, what happened in that situation by using that Christian tactic, if you like, was that some of the people who didn't like me because they believed what these people had said about me previously, so they believed I was this evil person, suddenly could see that I wasn't this evil person. And because I wasn't giving these people a rise, I was just staying principled and turning the other cheek, they could also see that they were actually quite awful. And so what I managed to do is turn a few people who are still quite what we would call, I don't know, kind of anecdotally as woke, in their beliefs, in their ideological beliefs, sided with me against the people who were trying to cancel me. And so I think that we need to hold a door open to those people as well.
Absolutely.
I think there are people who believe in critical social justice and may have a point. I want to hear what they have to say, so long as they're not demonizing anybody. And so those are some people that really, really, and many people on the right, the tribal right, because I don't think it exists ideologically, will say that anybody who has any kind of semblance of a critical social justice outlook on the world is evil and cannot be reached and cannot be reasoned with.
Mm-hmm.
Even John McWhorter, and I'm not saying he's right, he's probably left, but even John McWhorter said that you can't reach the elect, you can't reason with them, and sometimes that's true. But in many cases it isn't. There are ways of reaching these people.
I think,
and there are tried and tested ways.
Yes.
One of which comes from the Bible.
Yes. The biggest problem that we have is that there's at least 1 or 2 generations of people on this planet that critical social justice was presented to them as the truth. There were, teachers and parents and professors and political leaders that are saying that what you have here is the truth. So people have been taught to believe that the best way to solve our problems is to dehumanize each other. And with that false Republican, Democrat, or left versus right globally divide, is you have people equally split into these 2 camps, whereas if we could just reshuffle, get rid of those 2 camps, those 2 things, and have everybody in one pile and say, okay, everybody, here are our options. Either we honor the dignity of all human beings and we make that the litmus test, which is, this is the liberal way of being, and we find, how do we protect the individual rights of everybody, and what is our individual responsibilities as well, because with freedom comes responsibility. We either choose that, or our option is, you are no longer an individual, you are part of an identity group, and your group is going to be in conflict over power and resources with other groups. Those are the 2 options right now. In this moment in time, that's the only 2 ways to regroup and form, I guess, a new foundation for political thinking, a new foundation for philosophical thinking. Is, do I agree with this notion of human dignity and honoring all people, like those ideas of the Enlightenment, like those ideas that came out of the Judeo-Christian era? Or essentially, do I want to just kind of revert back a few thousand years and just be very tribal in nature and this constant dehumanizing way?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the way I see that the world order is going. The US Navy no longer has the incentive to keep globalism up, seeing that the Soviet Union is gone and China is about to collapse as well, by the look of it. It really is now the liberal world order versus the authoritarian world order. The authoritarian world order in the form of Xi Jinping and Putin, maybe with Saudi Arabia, along with that, Iran. Saudi Arabia and Iran are likely to break out in a conflict soon. The only option is the liberal world order. Everything else, follow the evidence. If there was evidence of authoritarian and identity-based societies flourishing, then I would go along with that. Even if I thought that it was objectionable from a moral point of view, I would concede that, look, these societies seem to work. There is no examples of any societies working. The closest you can get is China, and that's falling apart now economically. Mm-hmm. But the only reason why China flourished for a while, in the end part of the last century and for the most of part of this century that we've been here, is because they were completely sustained by demand from the liberal order, right? We were buying all of their stuff, and they had cheap labor. They don't have the demographics to keep up that cheap labor, right? So they're done. So that's they could flourish because liberalism had built a successful economic world order. I don't see how those parts of the world survive without liberalism, and I don't see how we can do it either. But there are forces in government who are seriously playing around with really, really, really dangerous ideas, and you can see the damage that it's done. I mean, like, here's one example. Why was it? I'm vaccinated. Why was it really so evil to be questioning whether a vaccine is a good idea or not for you? It seems to be pretty clear that if you're under 40 years old or 45 years old or something and you're reasonably healthy, there's no real need to get a COVID vaccine unless you have some, complication. Can do if you want to. Also, there are blatant, we have authorities that are stealing their power from this idea of liberalism, that are suppressing debate in order to protect themselves. The situation with the Wuhan lab leak. I was denounced as being a racist conspiracy theorist for saying that, come on, guys, like, the only institute in China that studies those viruses is in Wuhan.
Yeah.
And that happens. Okay, if you give me evidence, Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? Well, the extraordinary claim was that it had a zoonotic origin point in the only city in China, which is over like 1,000 miles away from the nearest relatives in Yunnan. That's an extraordinary claim. And yet the people who claim science as an authority, the skeptic movement, were saying that was a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. The newspapers were saying it was a racist conspiracy theory. So we have forces of ostensibly liberal, because that's how they got there, right? They're American, British, authority who are stealing the good name of liberalism in order to push through illiberal ends, which is terrifying.
It is terrifying. And that's another example of the top-down tyranny that's being imposed on us as well, is with the vaccines and the passports and the no jab, no job policies that a lot of people had to comply with. And so when I see things like that happened, it does make me a little curious about, will the liberal order survive? Because so many people in their hearts and minds are illiberal, even though they may think they are quote unquote liberal. They're advancing illiberal and indignified ideals.
Okay, so I do a podcast with a social psychologist, and she would never go as far as what I'm about to say, but I'm talking to a Christian. And so I'm going to advance a certain idea that I think will resonate with you. And I'm reasonably sure, even though I don't have enough evidence to be confident, but I'm reasonably sure is true. What do you notice about the illiberal individuals from a psychological point of view? Anthony Fauci, for example, the way he speaks. What do you notice about him?
A very... a little smug, overconfident. Give me more. I am the authority on this subject.
Give me more. P begins with P. Christian sin.
Oh, prideful.
Prideful, right? He's
yes.
really, really, really prideful.
Yes.
Can people like that do much good in the world? Is it possible? How long can they really hold on to power? How long can an institution that has been completely subverted by pride hold on to power? I'll give you another example.
A lot of these people have been holding on to their power for 30, 40 years.
Yeah, but that's not long in a civilizational time frame, right?
Right.
So you look at, like, Xi Jinping, who was purged, within the leadership of the Communist Party, has a cult of the personality which is second to and perhaps even rivals Mao's, right? And so what he's done to the Communist Party of China, there used to be different factions within the Communist Party, and they would bicker and squabble and hold each other to effect. What he's managed to do is just to purge all of his enemies. And so now nobody can tell him the truth. The same situation in Russia with the war in Ukraine, right? How is it that Russia's military is doing so badly? Well, because Putin completely purged his military of anybody who was vaguely competent, because he was worried that competent people would be able to challenge him for power, which they would be able to. But one point of liberalism is that we know that we need these people, even if we don't like them, because they call us on our crap, right?
Yes. That's what makes liberalism successful, is because people engage in good faith, the exchange of ideas, and the better ideas rise to the top.
Right. And so what does that cause? That's what creates the kind of societies that we live in today. That's why they're so successful. And it's also why China's so successful, even though they're authoritarian, because, they're getting their demand from us. But what I'm saying is you can't construct a society around pride and have it last for very long. It will, by nature, destroy itself.
Okay.
And so the aspects of American culture that have been subverted by these individuals will destroy themselves as a matter of course, and probably in quite quick order. I mean, is Fauci going to survive all the stuff that's coming out about him now?
I don't know, but if the aim is for them to destroy themselves, it's being done in real time right now. And the Great Reset is this grand plan to reset everything once it's destroyed, because it's so awful. So we set things in place 50 years ago, and we've been advancing these illiberal ideas and these tyrannical ideas in pockets for over 50 years. It's just within the last, I'll say maybe 5 years, that there are more destroyers. There are more of the illiberals in our institutions, through the DEI bureaucracies and through the woke literature in the entertainment. There's just more of that than there is liberty-based culture. So liberty-based culture is dying out in atrophy.
Is it though? I know it looks that way. It certainly seems that way, right? It certainly appears that way.
It does appear that way.
But if you look at the figures, if you look at the data, for example, on America's Hidden Tribes, which was done in 2018, I think, it's fairly up to date, pretty good estimation. It said that the woke left are no more than 12% of the population of the United States, and probably most of those people who are the woke left are probably, I'd probably say 7% of them are probably fairly decent and wouldn't cancel anybody anyway. Just have some worldviews that I would regard as largely wrong. So there's no evidence to suggest that they've actually captured the main population. If you look at, the woke left tend to be highly privileged and white, and that's why they've captured all the elite institutions, because they're there in, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, the media, social media, so on. Which would be a really good argument for systemic racism, by the way, if you wanted to make it.
Right. Okay. Let me look at that percentage that you just gave. Okay, so only 12% is
off the top of my head.
Off the top of your head. Let's say that 12%, they're the ones, the hardcore, they know the ideas that they are advancing.
Oh no. Oh, come on.
Well,
what, you think the woke left read the books that they claim to value? They don't read those books.
Well, let's just say there's that small percentage, because I know people that do. But there's what concerns me is the larger percent that say, "Oh, they don't mean that," or "Oh, they're not doing that," or they think that the illiberal woke are just advancing the ideas of the civil rights movement. So it's not just the main leaders and the ones that believe in this. It's the people that have no clue of what they are advancing, but because they are in the bureaucracies, because they're naturally advancing these philosophies and practices, even if they are unaware, because those philosophies and practices are the standard norm for workplace, for school, and for societal interaction.
Okay, so there's a public problem and there's a private problem, a public sector problem and a private sector problem. I don't see how the private sector problem doesn't go away on its own. Like, what is going to happen to Disney?
Well, so
did you hear about the latest investor call that happened where you had, like, I think it's Bob Iger or whatever his name is, who's the new chairman, the once and future king, where he got lambasted. The company's just destroying itself, and eventually it will go away. If somebody within Disney does not turn around and turn its back on all this nonsense that they're coming out with, then Disney will cease to exist and something will take its place. That's the nature of capitalism, another part of liberalism.
Well, so the solution to fix that, not from the liberal standpoint, but the illiberal, what the World Economic Forum and what's being done is the ESG scores that businesses have to apply to, which is why you see a lot of businesses making these decisions that really don't make sense. Like, for example, Dylan, whatever his name is, the person that's been a woman for over 365 days that got invited to the White House, that is now Nike is paying this person, and Bud Light of all products. When I think of a Bud Light drinker, I don't think of somebody that is going to see a picture of a trans person on a can and say, "Ooh, that's going to make I'm going to go buy that." But what I know is that when companies do that, they are rewarded with a high ESG score.
Doesn't translate to profit.
Well, if we are getting rid of capitalism, because the ESG is part of stakeholder capitalism, this new economy that is being ushered in. I know it doesn't make sense from a
it doesn't
profit.
Work.
It's not. No. But this is what is being implemented now. This is what these tentacles, these policies are already in place, and that's why it's up to us and all these people in these businesses and organizations to pause and say, okay, where is this taking us? And by us, I mean the future of humanity. And is this a path we really want to go down?
So again, I'm going to talk to you in Christian again. These are the prideful workings of Lucifer. Like that's what they are. And they're doomed to fail. They're utterly doomed to fail.
In the long run,
they can do damage. Oh, in the long run. So the question is not whether they will fail, because they will fail, because this kind of thing always fails. The question is how much damage do they do? And so our business is, how do we mitigate the damage? How do we push back on them? Even though we know that we're assured of victory in the end, how do we push back on them? How do we stop them doing as much damage as they are? I think what we need to do is to fall back on the traditional backbone of our culture. And I see Britain and America as being having a shared culture to a large extent. And you mentioned liberalism, you mentioned the Enlightenment, you mentioned the Judeo-Christian ethic. I would agree with all of those. I would emphasize the Jewish one as well.
Yes.
Because it's the amount of anti-Semitism that's going on right now is appalling and astonishing. And again, coming from both tribal camps, if you like.
From both tribal camps. Yeah.
Because I think the left and the right exist, but let's call them what they are. They're tribes. They're not coherent ideologies or philosophies now. That they maybe once had their origin points, but you know, the left was supposed to be representing the kind of person who would drink Bud Light, right? Not a rich white intellectual in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Who would be the kind of person who would be more interested in, I don't know, whatever that irrelevancy's name is. I have no opinion of him, her, they, whatever. I know nothing about reserve judgment. So yeah, we need to lean back into those pillars of our culture: Enlightenment, the Judeo-Christian ethic, liberalism, but also another one I want to emphasize as well: the Greco-Roman aspect. You know, the likes of Plato, of Aristotle, Socrates, who was talked about by Plato, Epicurus, the philosophical basis of the way in which we think, in which we reason. Because one of the points of liberalism is that the whole point of the academy, the whole point of Socrates and dialectic method was, okay, we get that the truth is important. Okay, so we accept that the truth is important. So how do we get to the truth as quickly as possible? Well, we separate our egos, and to be fair, we can't do this entirely, but to the best of our ability, we separate our egos from the arguments that we're presenting so that we can have at each other and chip away at each other's positions until we get to the truth. That's how we quickly get to the truth. That's baked into our culture. The Japanese don't have that. The Chinese don't have that. And this is the very reason why in Western cultures, with various different ethnicities, we have so much innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Which is easily measured, for example, in Nobel Prizes. The amount of Nobel Prizes that the United Kingdom has versus China, for example, which is a vast nation. The UK is tiny. And yet the UK has way more, something like maybe 3 times as much. I don't know. I'd have to check, but certainly a lot more than China does. Because we have this liberal Greco-Roman tradition of interrogating each other.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're getting offended by stuff, that's your problem. That's something you have to deal with. You shouldn't be this sensitive. We seem to have kind of invited in this sense of fragility, that fragility is something to be celebrated.
Yes.
But if you get offended, that you become a victim. And don't get me wrong, I think that the offense and the sense of victimhood is very often real. But it's not a good thing. You shouldn't be feeling that way. Why are we celebrating this?
By celebrating victimhood and being a hero and feeling good in victimhood, you never allow yourself to really achieve.
Well, you can't.
You can't. And the principle of the ideology is for people not to achieve. So it's
right, to hold them perpetually down.
It's a psychological way of trapping people by making them feel celebrated in their victimhood.
And if you think about it, that's abuse.
It is
You're
abuse.
abusing people.
It is. It's psychological abuse for a political cause, and that's another main reason why I speak out, because I see good-hearted, good-intended people that are being psychologically manipulated and controlled and limited by adhering to a dehumanizing, illiberal, anti-human ideology.
And here's another thing on top of that. What is going on with all of this smashing up the history of the West? Like Britain, for example.
You got to get rid of the 4 olds. It's Mao's Cultural Revolution Part 2. By getting rid of the 4 olds, getting rid of all of the history, all of the ideas in the past, then the perfect version of humanity will just somehow emerge from the ashes and the rubble.
But isn't it perverse? Like on some
Yes.
like fundamental level, it's extremely perverse.
Yes.
I mean, it's like, like Hieronymus, Hieronymus Bosch, the painter who used to do the famous church frescoes of hell, so that when you go into church, you could see these kind of demonic things. I think he was Dutch. And you would be afraid of them, and that was why you would keep your faith in Christianity, because at that time not a lot of people could read, and hence, that's why a lot of Christian art was so big.
Mm-hmm.
Not just, like the ecstasy of Saint Teresa and stuff like that. Some of it was very beautiful, and had both sides. Bosch was kind of the negative side. I look at some of these award ceremonies and people dressed as tormenting demons, and like, what's going on there? Like, you are taking the archetype for something that you don't have to believe in the supernatural. I don't think I do believe in the supernatural existence of God, but even on the symbolic level, you have this idea of that which is pure and sacred and appreciated for generations within your tradition, and then at the highest stage in your culture, which is Hollywood, you're celebrating the adversary, the demonic. What is going on there? I mean, a horror movie, okay, fine. You want to do The Exorcist? That's a great movie. I love horror movies. But to that extent, I mean, what is going on with these people?
Yeah, I don't know. Some of those performances, some of the things I see in the culture look like satanic rituals.
They do. They look like a black mass.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot going on.
What do you think you're doing? Seriously, what do you think you're doing? Why do you think that's a good idea? There are centuries of reason. And again, you don't have to believe in the supernatural existence of God. Surely you would look at the society and realize where we are as in Britain and America, and how good things are, and that maybe there are loads of things to critique about Christianity, but that's a big part of the reason where we are where we are.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be a religious person to recognize that. And then suddenly you want to create, I don't know, a mockery, a kind of a satanic masquerade.
Yep. And
I mean, that's deeply, 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 deeply strange.
It's
deeply strange.
It is deeply strange. That's one of the things I may have to touch on in a separate special, because like I said, there's a lot going on and things continue to intensify. I guess my final thought there is that the basic virtues of liberalism are
Christian.
Well, are truth, beauty, and goodness.
Yes.
Those are the three most, I guess, famous or discussed virtues of the liberal world, are pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness. And the new culture views truth, beauty, and goodness as oppressive, as white supremacy, and the pursuits that I see of the new culture are just pursuing kind of nothing. So this nihilistic, cynical power, pride, and greed, which those are in direct contrast to truth, beauty, and goodness.
Truth, beauty, goodness, and humiliation. Humility, I should say.
Humility. The opposite of pride.
The opposite of pride. And humility is what you feel. So one of my hobbies as a young man in England was visiting churches. Because in the UK you've got, when the Black Death swept all across the UK, and a lot of the villages were just wiped out, but the stone churches, because the village houses would have been wooden, the stone churches still stand. So especially in Norfolk, which is part of the east of England, you can wander through these villages and you can find these absolutely exquisite old churches, really without a community to sustain them anymore, but they're still there. And just going into those places and feeling that connection with the past and enjoying the beauty of the architecture, sometimes of the stained glass, the philosopher Roger Scruton talks about this. I don't know if you know of him.
Mm-mm.
I would suggest you look into him. He's a really wonderful English philosopher who died recently. That gives you a sense of wonder, of appreciation, of gratitude, and of humility, because I couldn't build something like that. No way. And I doubt very many modern architects who could throw up, a skyscraper could build something like that either. It doesn't mean to say they're any worse. But we have this, this sense of who we are, that's not ethnic, and is not purely ideological, although has the liberal ideological element as well. But we have this connection with our past, and the great triumph of liberalism and of Christianity, by the way, and this is where it comes from. This legacy is open to everyone.
It's open to everyone.
If you move to America or the United Kingdom, and you're an immigrant and you didn't grow up in that culture and you had no understanding, and you decide that you want to appreciate those things, the person who is in charge of, who's probably an old person who's retired, who's volunteering to show people, will be absolutely delighted that you have taken an interest in the cultural heritage of our civilization. And the same can't be true of other places. The same is not true of China.
No.
Maybe of Japan it is, but then Japan is a liberal democracy, has become one. And this is the essence of liberalism. It flows through Christianity, that it's open to everybody.
Before the Judeo-Christian era, people were not taught to recognize the individuality of others. That idea of selfless love is the key idea of the Judeo-Christian era. And that idea is central to liberalism. It's central. If we don't recognize and honor the individuality of others, we bully them, we dehumanize them, we other them.
Yep.
So if we can not see people as one of these neo-Marxist identities and recognize the wholeness of everyone and the worthiness of everyone, and then come together and figure out, okay, so how do we regroup from where we are now? How do we clean up this mess? And how do we move forward together in a way that we will all thrive? Those are the questions that need to be asked right now. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's pretty simple. What's holding us back? Okay, so you were telling me your computer just
literally, like, when something crashes, like usually you get like a blue screen, or you get like the application will crash, but the computer itself won't crash.
Yep.
Like literally I was speaking to you and I could still hear you talking, and then just the screen went black and there was like a squiggle of like pink and green and blue lines, and then it just turned itself off. It's never done that before. Never ever done that before.
I will say this. Not quite every time, but I'm presented with a new technical challenge. Something weird happens a lot. Damn near every single time Eric and I do something together, there's a technical glitch. There's something that I have to spend hours and hours and hours on. So I wonder if there's maybe that dark force out there that we alluded to earlier is hindering and interfering.
Because this is not like this is not using a lot of computer resources, like just talking over. I was just playing. before, I turned my computer on and off before I spoke to you. I was just playing like a high-end video game, Cyberpunk, right? And that's pretty much pushing my computer to its absolute limits in terms of graphics and that's the rest of it. This isn't. And yet my computer just dies in the middle of a low-intensity task that's going through an internet browser. I don't know.
And I feel like we had kind of we were touching on a very vulnerable, soft, real point at that time.
I think the point is quite simple, is that you treat people as individuals, regardless of whether you think that there is no such thing as free will. Maybe you have a point, maybe you have a good argument, maybe you're right. But nevertheless, in what seems at least like a conscious choice, you treat people like individuals. You don't judge them on the basis of their skin color or their social class or any other accident of birth. You treat them as if they were souls.
Yes.
And you don't have to believe in them souls.
Yes.
That's not required. But if you don't treat people like that, if you treat people as if that everything that they do is determined, then that's not going to get you very far in life.
No, it's not.
And it certainly won't benefit the society.
And it's not a way to build authentic and trusting relationships either.
No. And even if it was true, let's say we give you that it is true, that everything is determined and nobody has any free will and can make any choices whatsoever. How does that affect your decision making? Because you don't have the rationality needed to comprehend that anyway, even if it was true. Mm-hmm. So it becomes an utterly moot point. But the point of one of the key points of liberalism is that we do embrace that kind of Christian side of things, where we treat people, and we don't have to believe it, but we treat people as if they are unique souls with a spark of dignity in them.
Yes, sir. And
we believe that, so we have that in ourselves. And we don't demonize people and go after people unless they've, repeatedly behaved in awful ways.
Being up a little bit, what advice do you have? And let me give you of who I'm asking you to speak to.
Yeah.
Just the regular person that's out there in the world trying to make it, that sees what's going on and is kind of ignored it or not acknowledged, not got into it, a little unsure. What is your advice to that person?
Take heart, because evil cannot prevail for long. Evil is never, and I'm not talking about critical social justice being evil. I'm talking about the kind of evil that comes through critical social justice, that comes through something like standpoint epistemology, right? These things, evil can never be intelligent. The people who perpetuate it might be. But it, in and of itself, is destructive and ultimately self-destructive. And this is why all of the various regimes that did a lot of evil eventually tear themselves down. You will prevail. The forces of liberalism will prevail. Whether you're Christian or not, like me, you don't believe in a supernatural God. These ideas from an evolutionary point of view have evolved. It's taken centuries of institutions, of gradual changes for things to get better and better and better and better and better. Our society will survive this threat. Take heart. That's the first thing. You're not doomed. It's not going to be. These people will be dealt with. It will take time and they will do damage. Find a community. You can talk to us. You can find various people on Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Try and find people like you, because it can be very alienating. You can think that you're really, really alone, that these people have taken over everything. Actually, the empirical evidence shows that they haven't. They've dominated certain key institutions within society, which speaks to their makeup, because they're very, very privileged. They come from very, very privileged backgrounds, by and large. They're generally not ethnic minorities, for example. And try and find a community of people you can speak with about this. And there are plenty of people online, that you can find that you can speak to about this. And it's important to think that you're not the crazy one. You're not alone. And the kind of values that you have, the kind of liberal values that we've been talking about today or tonight are the ones that have stood the test of time. There have been times in various societies all around the world where these kind of values, not exactly the same ones, but these kind of values, such as in the Soviet Union, have come to the forefront and have dominated. But they didn't survive. And they won't survive in the future. And that's what I have to say on that.
Cool. So now I'm going to speak to the people that understand where we're at right now as far as the ideology and the political and economic tyranny that is also coming down along with it. Those people, and then I also want to speak with the people that are so passionate about eroding racism, sexism, and all the bigotries and all of the ills that critical social justice points to. Because most people hate racism, and most people are opposed to a Marxist way of organizing human society. If you really are opposed to those things, then liberalism, open source liberalism, and the human dignity that is needed, that is where your answer is. That is where the answer is. That is the solution to the problem that you are hoping to address. However, if you stay in these tribal camps and continually dehumanize the other, then that very precious thing will be lost. And it may not be lost during your lifetime, but the lifetimes that are coming up behind us right now, it will be felt there. And I believe that we owe the future everything. I believe that it is up to us to prepare for a better future for those coming up behind us. That's been the history of, that's how humans have evolved for these previous thousands and thousands of years. And now that we're being asked to take giant steps backwards, I feel like we all need to come together in this moment. And I've been saying that for years, and the division and the intensity and the amounts of prejudice, aggression, and cruelty that I see in society and on my social media feed are constantly increasing. So when is enough? When have we had enough? And when can we decide to choose joy and love and peace and unity and together, and to break the shackles of the divide and conquer? I don't know, man.
Jolly good. I think that's nearly 2 hours, isn't it?
I think so. You have anything else before we sign off?
No, I think that's it. Just come and have a look at my podcast, which is called The Dissidents. Should be able to remember that. What we do in our podcast is we look at the philosophy and psychology of critical social justice, of mobbings, of what's going on inside people's brains when they target you. So hopefully we try to kind of equip you with some of the tools that are needed to push back. We're also, both Jason and I, are affiliated through the Institute of Liberal Values, so are very similar in our ideological outlook, if not our accents, which are remarkably different.
Yes, we'll have to do more
absolutely
fun with accents.
Yes, more fun with accents.
And since we are both with the Institute for Liberal Values, and that is what's at the forefront of our thinking and way of being right now, I'm sure we'll be doing lots more content together in the future.
I certainly hope so.
I do as well. Thank you, Mike. I'm
Pleasure.
very grateful for your time. And everybody else out there, until next time, be cool to each other and let your soul shine.